is the worldwide upheaval, and this is dealing with what we're exactly seeing today, worldwide upheaval on a scale never before. And this is what Jesus Christ, what he clearly told his disciples that they could expect prior to his second coming. And they asked him that question. They asked the question that, frankly, I wish people would ask more today. How do we know? What are the signs? And again, that's what this whole series is about. 10 different signs to indicate that we're headed for the final countdown. But in Matthew, the book of Matthew, that's where the disciples asked Jesus, well, how do we know? Do we have any indicators of your coming? And, of course, when they asked the question, it was during Jesus' first coming, and they were expecting him to come and become a great political ruler and overthrow the Roman government. That's what they wanted. But it wasn't time yet. His first coming was to secure the forgiveness for our sins. His second coming, which is rapidly approaching, hence this series of Final Countdown, is he will secure rulership of this world. And so when they asked that question, their motives were different, but Jesus answered it obviously correctly. He tells them, this is what you can expect on my second coming. And the text says this: Jesus left the temple and he was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its building, the great Jewish temple. Do you see all these things? He asked. And he said, I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Now, just as a little side note there, that's exactly what happened when the Romans overthrew Jerusalem. They also completely annihilated the city, including the temple. In fact, Jesus clearly said that everyone will be thrown down, the stones there. And that's exactly what happened, because when the Romans set fire to the temple, all the gold in the temple melted and went into the cracks of the stones. So if you were a soldier, what would you do? You do what they did, and that was they tore up every little stone to get every little piece of gold they could get, fulfilling that prophecy. But Jesus continues on, and they're sitting there, and they said, well, tell us, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming? And at the end, specifically the phrase there, at the end of the age. Well, Jesus answered, he says, first of all, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming that I am the Christ, and will deceive many. We'll get into that much later, specifically on the topic of the rise of falsehood, false Christs. But he says you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. But see to it that you're not alarmed, because such things must happen, but the end is still to come. And he says nations will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And he says there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. He said all these are just the beginning of birth pains. And so we see in that text there a couple different things that Jesus clearly gives an indication of a second coming. And the first one there, I'll actually start with the last one that he left off in that text, and that's earthquakes. That there would be a rise of earthquakes. And again, we're dealing with things on a global scale, not a local scale, but a global scale. And of course the scoffer would look at this passage and once again, to play the scoffer. And that's what we do through this whole series. Is like, okay, what's so different this time, Christian? You guys have been saying this for 100 years. You guys have been setting dates, in which of course we don't do that because that's not biblical. But what makes this so different? Earthquakes, who cares? We've always had earthquakes. And that's true. There's always been earthquakes on planet Earth, except, here's the point, in the last century alone. In the last century alone, we've seen nothing short of an explosion of worldwide earthquakes like never before. And there is a huge argument online of people that say, well, this is a bunch of baloney. The only reason why there's a rise of earthquakes is because of the current technology to monitor earthquakes, and we don't see any evidence of that. And, the research that I did, I found to the contrary, that there does seem to be historical and even new evidence that there is, in fact, the rise of earthquakes. Also, just kind of an interesting side note, I was recently asked by Morningstar Entertainment to be a part of a History Channel special that they're putting together. And their premise for the special of the program that they're putting together is basically that the, quote, scientific community and, to use their term, the religious community are for the first time agreeing on these issues. And, of course, one of the issues being talked about is an increase, yes, from the scientific community agreeing that there is earthquakes. But let me give you an idea of some of the research that's out there showing us that you tell me if there's not, in fact, a rise of earthquakes, just like Jesus said would happen. From the year 100 AD to 1800, that's a span of 800 years, there's about 21 earthquakes 6.0 or greater. From 1800 to 1900, that's a span of only 100 years, there was 18. From From 1910 to 1929, that's in just 20 years, as opposed to 100, there was 4. From 1930 to 1949, in 20 years again, this time there was 9. In the 1950s alone, in 10 years, there was 9. In the 60s, there was 13. In the 70s, there was 51. In the 80s, there was 86. And from 1990 to 1994, there was over 100 earthquakes in just 5 years to that degree. Now, that's the big giant ones, okay? There was a couple years ago, I was preaching to the congregation here on the issue of God's wisdom, that obviously He is omniscient, He's all-knowing, just a basic definition of a supreme being. And one of the ways He demonstrates that, of course, is the issue of Bible prophecy. So that was towards the end of 2006, and so I went online to the USGS Geological Survey website just to get an account of how many earthquakes had occurred that week in the United States. And so I had that stat, and at that week, believe it or not, in just the U.S., there was 454 earthquakes just in the U.S. in 1 week. That was massive. Now, when I went through this study with the final countdown, about a year and a half later, I just happened to go up onto the website to see if there was, current information. And that had rose from 454 earthquakes in just 1 week. It just so happens there was 1,100 in 1 week in the U.S. I joke about it all the time. I says, everybody's really hooked on this weather channel. Say, forget that. Apparently we need to have an earthquake channel. Well, in all seriousness, I joked with, there's so many earthquakes that we need to have, forget the weather channel, we need to have an earthquake channel. But that really is the point. 1,100 earthquakes in 1 week in the U.S., you'd think you'd hear about it. And really what's going on is there's so many happening, you only hear about the really giant ones. But the point is obvious. We are experiencing a massive rise of earthquakes like never before. And that's just, earthquakes in and of themselves last for a short time, but the devastation continues on. They cause billions of dollars worth of damage. They kill thousands of people. One quake alone in Tangshan, China, killed 255,000 people. And it's getting worse. And to the fact, speaking of scientists, here's a direct quote. They say the increase of severe earthquakes have led the scientific community to predict, quote, we are entering a new period of great seismic disturbances. Now, where have I heard that before? That sounds like exactly what Jesus said would happen. And the problem is they're saying also the death toll from earthquakes is going to absolutely explode due to the fact that there's this mass exodus of people who are moving out of the rural areas into the big cities. And, of course, the problem is many of these cities just happen to be built on top of the fault lines. And the scientists are now saying that we're entering a time when fatalities just from earthquakes, the stat I had shared was 1 million people at a shot will not be uncommon. I just came across, I think it was 2 weeks ago, came across a more current stat, and now they bumped it up from 1 million to 3 million people could be annihilated just from an earthquake. But here's the point. Here's the point for the scoffer. The world is being shaken like never before. Of course, yes, we've always had earthquakes, but nothing like we see today, just like the Bible said would happen when you are approaching the end of days. But that's not all. Jesus is very, very replete with His disciples. He says the second sign to indicate you're headed for this worldwide upheaval, you're getting close to the end of times. Not just that there's going to be an increase of earthquakes, there's also going to be an increase of famines. And that's what they said. They said, tell us, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And again, a lot of people say, hey, if God's loving, if He really cared, if He really existed, and we really are heading towards Armageddon, the time of the tribulation, He'd let us know. Well, He did. It's just unfortunate people don't crack open the Bible and discover what's going on. And here's what He says. What's the sign? He says there's not just going to be earthquakes in various places, there's going to be famines. All these are the beginning of birth pains. And again, the scoffer would sarcastically state something like, hey, whoop-de-doo. Okay, Christian, we've always had famines. Do a history test. And again, that's true. There's been lots of famines, okay? But here's the point. Again, nothing like we see with an explosion of not just local, but worldwide famines like never before. Right now, the World Health Organization estimates that right now, while 1/3 of the world is well fed, certainly you and I here, the majority in America, still at the same time, 1/3 of the world is underfed. And right now, while you and I are having this interview, Dr. Monteith, and the people are listening, 1/3 of the world is starving to death right now. That's their estimates. That's never happened before. Just in the 1990s alone, just in that decade, 100 million children starved to death. absolutely mind-boggling. A total of 4 million people are going to die, they estimate, just in this year alone, which also means, if you want to, for those of you hooked on math, about the time you finish to this interview, about another 400 people are going to die due to famine conditions. But the question is this: well, hey, wait a second. This is mankind. This is mankind. We're so technologically advanced. You know, we're going to try to achieve Star Trek. We're so advanced. How in the world could this ever happen in the midst of such an advanced era ever? Well, some of the indications that we bring out on the final countdown is obviously, of course, due to war. Some of it's because of embargoes, obviously government corruption. Some of it is economic debt and things of that nature. But one thing that I wanted to bring up, because it usually doesn't get brought up too much, is because of the overzealous environmental movement. That one of the things they've done is stirred up restrictions on the usage of fertilizers, supposedly to save the planet. But it's really not saving the planet, because of just that one thing, of the restrictions on certain fertilizers. That is one of the reasons why it's on record that why 12,000 square miles of Africa is a year, 12,000 square miles a year of Africa is turning into desert.